So thank you everyone very much for joining the Australian Behavioural Science Meetup tonight. We've switched the time back to the evening for this talk to accommodate some great speakers that we've got joining us from Zurich and London. Do give us feedback if you have any requests for future sessions and when you would like those to be hosted and what times are a bit easier. I'm delighted tonight to welcome our speakers. We've got two speakers from Swiss Re. So this is Francesca, Tamma and Maura Feddersen. We've brought you a number of different topics over the past year, a wide variety of topics. So some about health decision making, some about making decisions as couples around your finance. And we wanted to bring this different topic to you today because I think it's really fascinating. So this topic is around forecasting and looking at decisions in the future. And particularly when we're using expert judgment, how we can reduce the cognitive biases and improve the accuracy of expert judgment. Francesca and Maura are going to be able to do a much better job at talking to it. But this is something that we see used by in many different settings. So for example, The Economist uses this each year when they try and look at forecasting on economic and political decisions and how they can reduce the bias and improve those outcomes and estimates. So I'm really delighted to introduce our speakers today. Francesca Tamma, as I said, joins us from Swiss Re. She leads the Swiss Re Behavioural Research Unit, which is a unique global team of experts in the field of behavioural science. They design and execute behavioural science solutions for problems in the insurance sector. Francesca joined Swiss Re in 2016, and before that she worked at the famous Behavioural Insights team, a leading consultancy set up with a contribution of Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler. Maura Feddersen has over 10 years experience leveraging insights from economics and decision sciences to improve the accuracy of forecast and decision making across public and private sector settings. As a product owner at Swiss Re, she's responsible for leading the development and scaling behaviourally informed digital products that allow experts to optimize their judgment in the face of increasingly complex and changeable business outcomes. Before joining Swiss Re, she worked as a behavioural economist for the UK's financial regulator and has a background in economic consulting and in the financial sector. Before we kick off with the presentation, I just wanted to say thank you to our sponsor who enables us to run these talks each month. The sponsor is UTS plus Business Futures, and we're really grateful that they enable us to host these events each month. We'll put some more information in LinkedIn about UTS Business Futures. Throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, please pop those in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A and discussion as with each of our sessions that we host each week or each month. So with further ado, I'm going to hand over to Francesca and Maura, and thank you so much for joining. I know it's very early where you are and we really appreciate you accommodating us and hearing about this interesting topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks everybody for joining, for making this an interesting exchange. Well, first of all, also big thanks to Aaron and Grace for having helped us get this all set up. And before we deep dive into the topic of forecasting accuracy, I wanted to introduce you to behavioral science at Swiss Re. This will be very familiar to Alison because she founded a team 10 years ago. And we've been standing on giant shoulders working on the topic of forecasting accuracy and many others. Where I'm going to ask you to share the slides. At the moment, I still see a black screen. I think that's going to come up shortly. Great. And I think if you could go to the next slide, I'll briefly talk through a little bit of behavioral science at Swiss Re. Thank you. So this is a little intro to indeed what we've been up to over the past 10 years. I think behavioral economics lends itself very well to insurance, as indeed you've learned through some of the past studies that have been presented in this network and beyond. This is for the reasons that behavioral science studies decision-making over future, and insurers do just that. And specifically, if you look at the core of what insurers make, especially actuaries, their job is to forecast accurately risks. And this is very much got something to do with accuracy and biases that decision makers are subject to. And so over the past 7 years, we set out with a team to look at how we could mitigate the susceptibility to such biases and enhance accuracy. We've also covered many other topics about applying behavioral science throughout the insurance value chain, may this be enhancing sales or retention, customer outcomes throughout the customer journey, but also for underwriting with accuracy, and also on the other hand of policyholders, honesty when they disclose their information at the underwriting and claim stage. So this is just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we've been up to for the past 10 years. And then I'll hand it over now to Maura to talk you through specifically about the topic of forecasting accuracy in insurance.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Francesca. What we thought we could start with is a warm-up exercise. So grab yourself a pen of paper, a pen and a piece of paper, or if you're at your laptop and it's easier to get a virtual Post-it or OneNote, I encourage you to open it up and jot down a range where you are pretty confident, so maybe 90% sure, that this range contains the number of Academy Award nominations that Meryl Streep has received over her career. Please don't Google the answer. So we're looking for a range, you're looking for a lower number and an upper bound where you are pretty sure that the correct number of Meryl Streep's Academy Award nominations is contained in that range. By the way, this is Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada, if you are wondering. And I'll give you just a few seconds to come up with your range, and then I will reveal the solution. Okay, so I trust you have a range that you are pretty confident in. So I'm going to now show you what the result is. And then I'm going to ask a question in the chat about whether you got this answer in the range or not. And we can get a sense from the group how well we've done. Okay, so the answer is 21. I see some people are adding, well, that's great. Here, what I propose to do is say, yes, got it, and you can like that one, or no, didn't get the range, didn't get the range, that's maybe best. So you can like the one that applies to you. Well done, there are some people that actually did get it. Well done to Dimitar. Yeah, didn't get it. Okay. If you didn't get it in the range, if you didn't get your range wide enough to get this answer inside of your range, you are in good company. We've worked with this question and many others and found actually only 25% of participants set their range so that they are able to capture the correct answer. Now, this carries over into business as well. And we are finding that the ranges tend to be about half the size they should be. And so what that means is that certain risks that Francesca was talking about that we face in the insurance industry, but of course beyond that as well, are simply outside of our field of vision. So we are susceptible to blind spots. We are susceptible to overconfidence, and this can be really costly. One more warm-up question. I'd like you to think back to a good decision that you made in the past. It could be a big one, it could be a small one, it could be one from your personal life or from your work life, it could be recent or long ago, essentially whatever comes to mind where you've made a good judgment call, a good decision. And I'll also give you a second. This you don't need to share this. I won't call on you. Just take a second to think of a good judgment call that comes to mind. Okay, now I'm going to post 2 more things in the chat. So firstly, this one, the outcome was good or the outcome was bad, because I'm interested in whether for that judgment call that came to mind for you, the outcome was good. And so please feel free to like the one that resonates with you. Okay, I see a lot of people are picking the outcome was good. Okay, someone had the outcome was bad. That's very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so most of us view a good judgment call as something that has a good outcome. I think that's very normal, natural to do. So we focus here on outcome quality. I'm using a framework that Annie Duke has come up with. And there's a distinction here, which I think is very interesting, between outcome quality and decision quality. So we tend to focus on outcome quality, but actually we could benefit from an earned reward where we've invested in the decision process and we had luck on our side. Or we could have, of course, luck intervene. Sometimes, of course, we might make a poorly reasoned decision and we have bad luck as well. So this is how the 2 dimensions come together. Now, we cannot control luck, but what we can control is our process. So when we invest in decision quality, we are on average more likely to achieve a better outcome in terms of better decisions, higher forecasting accuracy. And that's really the fundamental principle of why we are investing in these good judgment practices. Now, I don't have to tell an audience of behavioral science practitioners on this call today about all the ways in which experts can be inaccurate. I do find it helpful just to set the scene to refer back to an illustration that, among others, Kahneman and his co-authors uses. And so, firstly, we have the pattern of systematic divergences from the accurate result. So imagine here that you might be stepping on a bathroom scale every morning and your weight is always overstated. So you would face bias. We also see noise, of course. This is where we have simply inconsistencies. You step on the scale today, it's slightly overstated. Tomorrow, it might be slightly understated. Our impression, our findings from working with expert judgment in the context of insurance is that typically there's both a level of noise and bias in expert judgment. And so we are quite far away at times from the accurate estimate. Furthermore, in insurance, we actually have a specific additional problem that often we don't actually find out what the true answer is. We might be able to see here, as you can see, for the first target and the third one, that it's close together and therefore there isn't a lot of noise, but we have no idea about the level of bias. So that is an additional challenge that we face in insurance contexts, because often we're forecasting into the distant future. For example, what are going to be the number of fatalities from a certain disease in 10 years. It's a very long time until we actually find out the true answer. So there is lots of research, of course, by academics and research also that we've done at Swiss Re that suggests that that type of unwanted variation and bias that I've just talked about also is visible in insurance. And I wanted to share just a few examples to illustrate that further. For example, we asked the team of underwriters, how accurate are you in your costing? Now, underwriters are, of course, at times optimistic. Sometimes they are too conservative. In this case, we found they are by 6% too conservative based on the data we were able to see. Actually, I should rephrase that. They thought they were going to be too conservative. So the expectation here from the underwriters was that actual claims were lower than expected. This would, in theory, be a good thing because you're not paying out more than you reserved for. But in fact, they were by 5% too optimistic. So actually, claims were higher than the underwriters expected. And of course, that can lead to a reserving or profitability problem. So here we have an 11% gap between where people think they are versus where they actually are. And that could also suggest a miscalibration between underwriters and their risk-seeking behaviors. They might be seeking more risk than actually they should be in this context. And we find this is a pattern that repeats as well. So in another team, we actually saw a 39 percentage point gap between where underwriters thought they were in their costing versus where they actually are. And in this case, it was in both directions, towards conservatism as well as optimism. And so you would be pulling in the wrong direction. Why is it a problem? So of course, if you are too risk-seeking, you might end up with excessive claims. So that's a problem. But even if you are not risk-seeking enough, you might be letting go of good opportunities. You might set a premium so high that clients are starting to walk away, and you end up with a portfolio that isn't well calibrated. There's, of course, a well-known exercise done by Kahneman and co-authors where any two randomly matched underwriters who assessed the same case and needed to come up with a premium for an insurance policy actually interpreted that case much more differently than they expected. So they expected that the difference in their respective target premiums might be 10%, but it was actually a deviation of 56%. Replicating this exercise with a team of underwriters, we found a similar pattern. The expectation here was that my average colleague would differ by 27% in the premium that they might come up with. But actually the difference was almost as much as 80%. So here again, the question around what's the damage? So let's assume for that latter case that the actuarially fair price is somewhere in the middle. And so some underwriters might come up with a higher value, some might come up with a lower value. Again, at the higher level, you might see clients starting to walk away. You're getting some of the bad risks who are willing to pay that premium. On the lower end, you might end up with challenges around reserving profitability because your payouts are higher than expected. So that is how noise can be damaging in the context of insurance. And of course, a very popular example of bias here also visible is through the example of framing. We asked underwriters to assess the riskiness of underwriting a building in either a 1 in 100 year damaging hail zone, or a building with a 39% chance of being impacted by damaging hail in the next 50 years. Now, actually, that riskiness is equivalent, but underwriters, of course, responded differently. So 74% of underwriters responded differently based on how those risks were presented. And so that's just one of the many, many examples of biases that we see are visible in an underwriting insurance context. Now, with all these examples of inconsistency, bias in insurance, we might say, enough with the expert judgment, let's work with data only. But there are, of course, situations where we still need experts. And in fact, situations in which experts are quite well positioned because they are able to, if we give them certain structures to use, to navigate high uncertainty and low data. So here are some of the examples where we find these situations of high uncertainty, low data, where expert judgment can perform well if we invest in process quality. So firstly, key trends. In the recent history, understanding the trends around COVID-19 fatalities, for example, or expectations about market developments. These are popular cases. Secondly, it could be about regime shifts. What is the moment at which interest rates start to rise? What's the moment at which they stabilize or also start to fall? The same with inflation. Or evolutions around geopolitics, policy decisions are part of this bucket. While if you have a case that is supported by lots of data, you might be comfortable to rely on a quantitative model. But actually, quite a few cases face a lack of data, including where you are looking to price a new segment, or you are evaluating a startup where you simply don't have that track record. This is another example where judgment becomes relevant. In an insurance context, of course, there's always an effort to try to anticipate the size of large losses as early as possible to make sure that the right reserves are put aside. And then lastly, this is also applicable in the context of sales planning, where there's a lot of optimism. You're trying to set certain expense assumptions. There's also a lot of expert judgment typically found there. And we found that the toolkit that Francesca will introduce in a second has been really helpful for exactly those domains I've just touched on. Maybe one more point before I hand over to Francesca. We are seeing this expert judgment toolkit very much as an ally to partner up with quantitative models. So this is really to equip actuaries and underwriters to also professionalize their expert judgment just as much as they are investing in the best quantitative models and using that for forecasting accuracy. Okay, Francesca, would you like to share a little bit about the history of this toolkit?
For sure. So about 6 years ago, shortly after I joined Swiss Re, Alison, who was at the time my manager, would have told me that the topic of bias and noise in underwriting was something on the minds of our senior managers. And so we set out to execute some of these noise audits to measure if indeed there was some problem that related to noise and bias. With some of these results and the evidence that this is a widespread and industry-wide challenge, we've reached out to some of the best academics and consultants in the space to try and understand whether something that came from other literature, other applications and sectors could have been applied within the insurance industry. So that's when we started reading some of these books, contacting some of these academics and exchanging on what could have worked. And the reason why I'm talking this through is if some of you are applied behavioral scientists, of course, finding out the best practice is very relevant, but it's also very relevant to understand how to successfully implement it in business. So with that purpose, I just wanted to talk you through a little bit of the early days, and then Maura will tell you a little bit more about the content of what we found that works. And so back to the early days of this project, indeed, we started finding out and testing whether some of these interventions could be relevant. So I remember going through a roadshow with some of the senior underwriters, asking them whether some of these best practices resonated, how they could implement them. And then luckily, some of the colleagues who were potentially very knowledgeable, but also very open to new methodologies, started seeing the similarities. And so that was encouraging, and we set out to pilot and evaluate whether implementing some of the best practices that Maura will discuss could have been relevant. And so we piloted these with a group of our EMEA, so European-based underwriters, and these are the colleagues that set price for reinsurance contracts. So they have to evaluate how big claims will be and how often these will happen. And then we provided some tools and decision-making hygiene best practices and checklists to aid them in their qualitative expert judgment in parallel, as Maura said, to their quantitative models. And then we evaluated and we reiterated on and on this model. And this is where we came up with the Swiss Re best estimates methodology. Today, this is fully adopted and sponsored by the chief underwriters and actuaries at Swiss Re, who are in charge of looking at the best practices for underwriting excellence and training these professionals within the company. It's been quite nice to observe over the years how this is really developed into a widely recognized and core underwriting practice. So Maura, I think this is a good point to hand it back to you to describe a little bit what the methodology entails.
Fantastic, thank you. I would like to invite you to participate in one more thought experiment. And in this way, we can illustrate one of the core components of this methodology. So imagine yourself for a moment at a wedding reception. The groom and bride are your friends, and you think they are very compatible. You're also having a great time. So the food is great, the drinks are flowing, it's great music, you're having a good time. But there's someone sitting next to you who maybe is not as much. They lean over to you and ask you, what chance do you give them? Now, maybe you help make that question more precise. So you say, okay, you mean in 5 years, what is the chance that they will still be legally married? And they agree with you. And then you think about that. And from your gut, you might say, very, very high, 90%. But maybe another way to look at that would be to start with a base rate. The base rate would be, in this case, for example, the average divorce rate amongst this demographic group in this region after 5 years. Let's say for simplicity, it's 50%. That would be your anchor. That's your starting point. Then you say, okay, but I know them. They are extremely compatible. Clearly, it's a beautiful event. I am pushing up my estimate. Maybe you end up at 60%, 70%, but you're no longer ending up with 90%. And that's exactly the point. We have a tendency to underweight the base rate, the prior information, and we overweight what is right in front of us, the specific information that pertains to a case we're looking at. So how does that link back to insurance, for example? You are an underwriter, you're assessing the riskiness of a deal. You might have just spoken to a client or broker. You've heard, if you're thinking of property, for example, how robust the buildings are, how good the flood protection measures are. So that is your specific knowledge. But another starting point would be to say, what is the market rate for underwriting this type of deal? What are other examples of similar deals that we've underwritten that could serve as a benchmark, that we anchor ourselves to that first before we get into the nitty-gritty of an individual case, and therefore find the right balance between these different types of information. Now, we found that actuaries and underwriters find this way of thinking helpful, and there are some more additional lenses that we offer them to structure their judgment. And there are both quantitative as well as qualitative benefits here. On the more quantitative side, we found after evaluating 150 forecasts across various teams that on average, having gone through this methodology in a pre-post type assessment, we see an improvement in accuracy of 10.2% on average. On top of that, there are various qualitative benefits. Earlier, we were looking at the ranges challenge, and we talked about avoiding glaring misses and blind spots. So that is something that we focus on a lot. We also encourage, through building up a base of documentation and evidence, that teams respond more quickly as trends move against them, but also more quickly if they see emerging opportunities. Because underwriters and actuaries share their thought process, there's an opportunity for junior members to pick up the ways in which the senior members think through a challenge and therefore to become upskilled. And because we are encouraging people to work through a specific sequence of steps, it also helps to encourage that decision hygiene, that discipline, but there's ultimately also a level of accountability at the end where we are able to see, as a team, have we invested in a strong process? And therefore, if we are wrong, it was bad luck? Or did we actually miss out on this investment and should have done better because it was high stakes and therefore the investment would have been worthwhile? Francesca spoke a little bit about the challenge of bringing this into teams, how it started with a pilot and now how we've been thinking about also rolling it out beyond individual pilots. So we think of it in terms of three main types of applications. Firstly, we think of it from the point of view of learning and engagement. It's a way of thinking that you can absolutely learn. So we offer various training options, live ones, e-learnings. We also run a forecasting competition where there's a weekly question. For example, if you might have heard of the room temperature superconductor, we asked whether there's going to be further evidence that this is going to that we have that scientific breakthrough or not. This goes out to a community of several forecasters who also practice and generate that muscle memory around good practices for forecasting. So that's on the learning and engagement side. And then there are two different types of application. Either we take an existing underwriting process or risk management process and tweak it to infuse some of these good judgment practices within that. Or we actually offer teams for their key judgments a full run-through of this methodology enabled by a digital tool that we have developed for the purpose of underwriters, actuaries going through the steps, documenting their journey and enabling that interaction amongst them. So these are the types of applications within teams, and we are looking to spread it more and more really across Swiss Re. But we've also found that given it's been really helpful internally, maybe this is also something that externally could be useful. So I think, Francesca, you're going to take us through an example, right? So I will move on to the next slide and hand over to you.
Thank you. And I realize it's really tiny, but as Maura has said, we've focused on how to bring this into teams, and being a commercial enterprise, we've also thought about how to bring this to other players in insurance industry, and specifically to the full actuarial profession. And so indeed, since last year, we've been working with insurers to improve their expert judgment using the methodology. Often the insurers would approach us when they are looking for enhancing their training for their in-house underwriting teams. And these may be trainings around expert judgment and decision-making, which is a recognized core component of the job of an underwriter. Or on the other hand, it may be that some companies are moving into new markets, new lines of business, and new business in general, which means that they may have limited previous experience or data on those topics. And therefore, they look out for help, as they're going to have to practice a lot of expert judgment. And so this is where we've put together a series of practices to support them. So a workshop that will talk them through the theory, but also apply the methodology to a tailored specific parameter that they're interested in practicing. As Maura alluded to, it takes time and practice to build the muscle memory to be able to implement this day to day. And this is where the value of a moderated workshop helps, as they're going through a few times the same methodology. We've also made available an e-learning that is the same one that we use internally. And then as of next year, the software that we use for the full process, which we've patented, will also be made available externally. And so the specific case study is with Apollo, which is a Lloyd's syndicate, which means is an underwriter that has a license in the UK for writing very specific, let's call them exotic motor risks. So if you have, for example, Uber or other similar shared driving platforms, or maybe hydrogen and new technology enabled vehicles, they'll be looking into underwriting those. So you can see this falls within the remit to the second challenge that I mentioned earlier, which is underwriting and forecasting risks for new types of classes of business. And this is where we got together, and they found it really helpful. This is a company that is already pretty innovative and was using something called the Delphi method, which comes from meteorological sciences, looking at how to group and bring together an elicitation coming from different experts. But they were missing the structure to go through some of the best practices and actually wanted to upskill everybody. So that's where some of the workshops have been helpful for them. I think this takes us to the end of the presentation that we prepared and wanted to open up for questions. I think we have one last slide where with our names, with a QR code and a website where you can find more information about this. And then one person who also works at Swiss Re is Nick Mingo. He now leads the APAC Behavioral Economics Consulting domain. So if some of these topics were relevant and you wanted to apply them in your professional setting, he'd definitely be able to work with you. But before we do that, I just wanted to thank you for your attention, for participating in the interactive questions and thought exercises that Maura set out for you. And we're happy to stay on for questions, of course.
Fantastic. Brilliant presentation. So I'll kick things off whilst people are writing your questions in the chat. Please don't be shy. You're not usually. What other settings use these techniques? For example, do governments use this with their forecasts?
From what I've heard, absolutely. Financial institutions and governments, I'm aware, are using these ways of thinking. And actually, a lot of this has emerged from the work of Philip Tetlock and many of his co-researchers. And it emerged from a competition that the intelligence community in the US, so FBI, CIA, etc., ran. They were trying to assess what could make us more accurate when it comes to key political risk and economics forecasts. And so this is where a lot of the work from Philip Tetlock emerged. And one of the books that Francesca pointed to is this book about super forecasting. And so we know that in addition to it being used in banks and in governments, specifically also this area of the intelligence community, this is one of the others that where this way of thinking is certainly applied.
And I would say, maybe to add to this, beyond these two more advanced industries that have made, well, sectors that have made the most of it, you can think of many others whose core businesses really depend on accurate forecasts. Some early interest and probably some applications that we're just not aware of, because not all of them are published, coming from the private sector, maybe pharma, where I understand there are a lot of technology and investments going to understanding which drugs will make it through the different levels of trials. Increasingly, we've talked about financial institutions, but you could also have even direct, well, let's say financial investment, but even betting that takes the shape of a prediction market, which is where not only you make your prediction, but you'll earn a payout that is proportional to how accurate you were. I'm sure many others exist, and we're actually happy to have conversations if anybody has other examples of where they've seen this being applied, to learn from that.
Throw it in the chat if you do. Be interesting to hear that. One of the things you mentioned is that one of the most important things is anchoring that starting point to make sure that's more accurate. Just wondered if you had tips on how people can do this if it's an unfamiliar territory. Let's say you're looking at a startup like Elon Musk's rocket to Mars. So how would you go about assessing that, where there's no real proven synergy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll try give it a start, and then maybe Francesca, you want to add to it. So the concept here is really to think of either you're taking a reference point from a larger statistical group, or you're looking for benchmarks of other examples. So for example, you're talking about the rocket to Mars, right? So what are other examples where we've initially ventured into space? How successful was that? How much did it cost? What is the difference between the initial estimate versus how much it actually was? If it was, say, 3 times the cost typically on average, could we use that as a base rate? I often think of, in the US, for example, there are these investment projects like the Big Dig in Boston, which was much more expensive in the end than initially thought. Same with in the UK, the Olympic Stadium, I believe it was, for example, 2 times as expensive. So we can use these types of examples then to draw on. Maybe you take an average of that, and that constitutes a base rate. I think because we look a fair bit at startups and how well they do. I think on average their success rates, how many startups make it in each industry after, say, 5 years on average. So that would also be a potential factor to consider. So here are some examples. You're thinking of the journey to Mars, both in terms of cost and likelihood to succeed. You might be looking elsewhere for other startups and how they've performed, also in a similar context. Ideally, I think of, for example, ambitions to the moon before we tackled Mars.
It is the hardest of the steps, because indeed it comes at the start, and where you probably have 20 make a start on a blank sheet of paper. So it is fair to say that this is probably the one on which most of the effort should be focused to try and then increase the accuracy. And of course, the difficulty with which one comes up with that answer will be proportional to the confidence interval that one comes up with, and probably gives you ideas across different scenarios and reasons why you might be wrong, so that you can then intersect them with the typical Bayesian probability estimate of saying, if that was the case, what would be the probability, and therefore what would be the outcome, and how do I combine that with my early assumption. So really hard one of the steps to start with. And when I say steps, is because I guess we didn't go through it, but starting with the base rate is one of a few guided principles that we would provide to the underwriters participating in methodology, and usually comes up first because indeed of that importance.
And from what you're seeing across the board, is this a common area of behavioral science, people focusing on debiasing decisions and better forecasting? Or is this an area you think is going to take off in the near future for the field?
What do you think, Maura? It's a good question.
I'm probably biased if I say I think there are opportunities to do more of this across the board. And actually, I'm surprised that it isn't as widespread as I think it could be. That's sort of that's my instinctive reaction to that. I think there's more that's possible. Maybe it's worth, and I think it also connects to Grace's question around how do you actually encourage behavior change? And maybe there's also a barrier in some cases where experts might say, but I am the expert. Why are you telling me that I should be using a particular process to arrive at my judgment? What about the value of my gut? I've always found my gut to be a very good decision maker. Are you saying I should intervene with my gut feeling? Or there might be those who say, well, actually, why do we care about expert judgment? Let's rather invest in the quantitative models instead, and in AI and those new avenues. So I think there's also, maybe to an extent, at times a bit of resistance, and it's worth thinking about how do we encourage experts to truly feel empowered by this type of toolkit, rather than feel like it is infringing on their freedom to make judgments as they see fit.
Thank you for tying Grace's question into that.
Yeah, happy to build on that a little bit more, because I already touched on what might be the challenges. So therefore, we really say to people, look, this is actually emphasizing the value that you bring as an expert, and therefore we're giving you the tools. Also, you can in future prove how much value you've added, because we are much more encouraging maybe than in the past traditionally have been, documenting what the thought process is. We close the feedback loop. Your forecast was X. The answer was Y. You have contributed to us getting slightly closer to the answer. Your reasoning was spot on. This is you have been delivering. And that is the type of also accountability and encouragement we want to offer individuals. So that's a key part of that change management challenge that I think Grace is speaking to.
I quite like that.
Maybe an interesting... You go, Aaron.
Oh, it's just that some of the people that you're probably working with in like underwriting it, there might not necessarily be a direct correlation to revenue, but by showing the forecasting and how that's improved, you can actually tie that straight back to revenue, which helps with your performance and everything. But you, Francesca?
Yeah, I was going to talk about the other side of the coin, which is if you're proven you're inaccurate, then you have evidence that you've not been a good performer. And so I also wanted to, I guess, spend a word of caution on this. Our strategy has always been, maybe conservatively, but I think it's worked out well, to actually focus on these being metrics. Well, focusing on this being a bottom-up project, meaning that we've always worked with the underwriters that wanted to develop these methodologies to improve the performance. So we always try to pick those teams that felt they had the opportunity to improve. And so they had a lower downside if things didn't work out as well. And then also we looked at these as enabling pieces of knowledge and tools for their own individual improvement, as opposed for a team lead to then get access to this data and then achieve perhaps management actions. And the reality is, it could over time identify very strong talent that is working very well in terms of accuracy. However, that is never the only skill set that is valuable to an organization, because we're never employed just to perform one task. And so you might have an input on that and rather identify through this a development opportunity for which we then have a whole series of interventions to help you improve. So that's an interesting thought process as well, to not only think about indeed the transparency and when it brings benefits, but also when it might bring negative facts and make them surface, and how do you manage that in advance, which also helps in turn with the change management.
It's a good point, I think, about the enthusiasm of different teams. That's certainly the case. But we are beyond the initial teams that are interested. We are also thinking more broadly, so infusing this into the capability frameworks for underwriters and actuaries at different levels of seniority, so that the idea is you exhibit that you live these principles, apply them practically as you go through your career. So it's really embedded there as one of the skill sets that underwriters and actuaries should have. And that also reinforces this piece that, yes, it's not only for enthusiastic teams, but it's really across the board. And that's been key for this change management challenge. I see there are some more questions, and trying to see if we have some ideas for them.
Yeah, so Dimitar's goes back to what Francesca was saying about the accuracy and the initial starting base, right, is so important. And I think Dimitar's asking, how much does the data quality bias affect the accuracy?
For sure.
Yeah,
well, I think
yeah.
I was going to say the main dimension is the lower the data quality, the more instinctively you rely on expert judgment, and probably ties with the question around where do we see the biggest effects. So in markets where insurers have really good data sets to rely on, and the core example that we keep going back to in our experience is Germany in the motor market. There is not so much space for this because the alternative is valuable. Again, we rely on expert judgment. We've not tested one against the other because we've not been able to do that, but we would rely on the experts' willingness to collaborate with us as a proxy for where this might have a bigger impact. So I would say data quality will increase the value of this approach, or lack of data quality. And then specifically when you bring this to different regions or categories, is which forecasts, which regions have such good data and proven models that don't shift the dial.
And it might not be high stakes. So you have good margins in a particular market anyway. You're not too worried about losing to competitors. At that point, maybe you say, okay, actually, this is not a burning platform for us. We want to rather look at some of the trends that are going in the wrong direction, or some questions we have about potential opportunities we'd be seeking. So there's a question around, do I want to spend the time to invest or not? And depending on whether it's a high stakes case or not, the answer might be slightly different.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask you both how you may be using these techniques in your personal life.
I will always use confidence intervals. So people might be a little bit annoyed. When are you going to get here? Well, between maybe 8 and 8:30. No, just tell me the time. Well, it might be wrong, so I might as well give you a range. So I think this is the quickest takeaway to really improve accuracy of communication. It might frustrate people if they want something more accurate, and then you can always shrink the confidence interval and, of course, decrease the accuracy. I don't know. What about you, Maura? Has this affected how you live your
really
daily
like
life?
that one. Yeah, I'm a big fan of that one. Another one that actually I find I used very recently is, would you bet on that? So someone said something, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it seemed a little bit questionable. So I said, hey, but would you actually put money on that? Are you just saying that? Or this, again, maybe is not the most diplomatic question, but actually it changes their frame to be a little bit more probabilistic, a little bit more potentially scientific, rather than potentially driven by strongly held views. So that's another question. There are several more, and I'd happily spend another hour talking about others, but yeah, that's maybe one example.
Fantastic. This has been an amazing talk. Thank you both for giving up your time so generously. For everyone that is wondering, this video will be posted in the LinkedIn group, so please check it out. We'll do that within a couple of days. Thank you both again. Such a great session.
It was a great
Thank you
pleasure.
very
Thanks
much.
so much for having us.
Have a good day.
Bye.